Let's be real for a second. You think you know the world, right? You read the news, listen to podcasts, maybe even throw out a few, well, actually statements at dinner parties. You're convinced you're informed. But here's the ugly truth. You're probably dead wrong about almost everything. And worse, you don't even know it. Oh, don't look so offended. I'm not saying you're dumb. I'm saying your brain is a liar. It feeds you outdated, overly dramatic, and flat out incorrect information about the world, and you lap it up like a cat at a milk bowl. You think the world is getting worse. You think poverty is skyrocketing. You think the rich are getting richer while the rest suffer. But what if I told you that's all nonsense? Welcome to Factfulness by Hans Rosling, a book that's about to slap you across the face with reality, if you can handle it. Introduction. Hans Rosling was a man on a mission. A medical doctor, professor of international health, and global educator, he spent his life fighting one of humanity's greatest diseases, devastating ignorance. You may not have known him, but the world did. His TED Talks have over 35 million views, and he made it to Time magazine's list of the 100 most influential people. That's right, people actually listened to him. Why? Because he had a superpower. He made statistics exciting, and not just exciting, mind-blowing. He could take a dry, boring spreadsheet and turn it into a thrilling, jaw-dropping reality check. His work with the Gapminder Foundation, alongside his son Ola Rosling and daughter-in-law Anna Rosling Rönnlund, was all about beating the chimpanzees, literally. Here's what I mean. If you ask people a set of basic questions about the world, poverty rates, life expectancy, education levels, they answer worse than random chance. A troop of chimpanzees guessing at the answers would outperform the average educated human. That's how wrong we are. And it's not just casual ignorance, it's systematic, baked in, media-fueled, fear-driven stupidity. Rosling knew this, and he wanted to fix it. He wanted to teach people to see the world as it really is, not as the fear-mongering news, doom-scrolling social media, and your grandma's chain emails would have you believe. He wanted to arm you with the tools to fight back against your own brain's worst instincts, and that's what this book is about. Factfulness is your vaccine against ignorance. It's your antidote to panic. It's the flashlight you need to stop stumbling around in the dark, terrified of shadows that aren't even real. By the time we're done here, you'll see the world differently. You'll argue smarter, stress less, and, dare I say it, maybe even be right about something for once. But first, let's see just how deep your ignorance runs. Ready for the first punch? Welcome to Mindful Reads Hub. Let's get started. Chapter 1, The Gap Instinct. Here's something nobody wants to admit. You love simple stories. You crave a clear-cut villain, a tragic victim, and a happy, or at least satisfying, resolution. You don't want complexity, you want good versus evil, rich versus poor, developed versus developing. You want the world to fit into neat little boxes, even when those boxes are absolute nonsense. That's the gap instinct at work. The human tendency to divide the world into two opposing groups and exaggerate the gap between them. Rich versus poor, west versus east, educated versus uneducated, and it's all bullshit. Hans Rosling spends this chapter absolutely eviscerating the idea that the world is neatly divided into developed and developing nations. He points out that this kind of thinking is not only outdated, it was never correct to begin with, but people cling to it because it feels right, it's dramatic, it makes for an easy story, and it keeps you comfortable in your ignorance. Want proof? Take a basic question. What percentage of the world's population lives in low-income countries? If you guessed anything higher than 10%, congratulations, you're dead wrong. The majority of the world lives in middle-income countries, not poverty-stricken wastelands, but your brain and the news you consume keeps feeding you a dramatically different picture. Rosling argues that the reason the gap misconception is so persistent is that people love binary thinking. You don't want a spectrum, you want clear categories, you want black and white, and because of that, you completely miss the fact that most of the world is gradually moving up the economic ladder. He introduces the 4 income levels, a concept so simple and obvious that you'll kick yourself for not realizing it before. Level 1, extreme poverty. You walk barefoot, cook over an open fire, and struggle to get clean water. Level 2, you've got a bicycle, maybe a gas stove. Life is still tough, but you're not starving. Level 3, you own a motorbike, maybe even a fridge. Your kids go to school. Level 4, you drive a car, eat at restaurants, and take hot showers. Yes, this is you. Here's the kicker. 85% of the world's population does not live on level 1. They are spread out across levels 2 and 3, steadily improving their lives. But you wouldn't know that because you've been fed the same doom and gloom narrative your entire life. Rosling absolutely destroys the myth that the world is split between rich and poor. He uses data to show that most people actually live in the middle, and the gap between rich and poor has been shrinking for decades. But guess what? The news won't tell you that because it's boring. World is slowly improving doesn't generate clicks. The growing gap between the rich and poor does. To drive this point home, Rosling gives a mind-blowing example: child mortality. He asks his audience how many children died per 1,000 births in Saudi Arabia in 1960. The answer, 242. Today, 35. That is an unbelievable improvement, but nobody talks about it because it ruins the simplistic narrative that some countries are doomed to poverty forever. So, what can you do to fight the gap instinct? Rosling lays out a few strategies. Beware of averages. Averages hide huge variations. When you hear about the average income of a country, remember that half the people are above that number and half are below. You're being tricked. Beware of comparisons of extremes. The media loves to highlight the richest billionaires and the most starving children. But guess where most people are? In between. Beware of the view from up here. If you're on level 4, every other level looks the same to you. But to people on level 1, the difference between $1 a day and $4 a day is life-changing. If you take anything from this chapter, it should be this: stop believing in us versus them thinking. The world is not divided into two camps. The gap between rich and poor is a myth, a lazy, oversimplified, media-fueled lie that keeps you ignorant. The truth is more complex, and frankly, it's a lot more hopeful. Key takeaway: the world is not divided into rich and poor. Most people live in the middle. If you want to understand reality, you need to abandon simplistic, dramatic narratives and start looking at real data. Chapter 2: The Negativity Instinct. Let's get something straight. Your brain is a drama addict. It feeds on bad news, hoards tragedy, and thrives on catastrophe. It's like that one friend who always has to out-misery everyone else. Oh, you had a bad day? Well, let me tell you about mine. Your brain does the same thing with world events. It zooms in on every disaster, every tragedy, and every reason to believe that things are going straight to hell. And here's the kicker: things are actually getting better, but your negativity instinct won't let you see it. Hans Rosling calls this the negativity instinct, our natural tendency to notice the bad more than the good. And let's be honest, it makes sense from an evolutionary standpoint. If our ancestors had ignored the bad, they'd have been eaten, poisoned, or fallen off a cliff. But here's the problem: you're not dodging saber-toothed tigers anymore. You're scrolling Twitter, watching 24-hour news, and convincing yourself that society is collapsing because one person in Ohio found a frog in their salad. Rosling breaks the negativity instinct into 3 major culprits. 1. We misremember the past. 2. The media selectively reports the worst. 3. We think it's insensitive to admit that things are improving. First, let's talk about your terrible memory. Humans have an astonishing ability to look at the past through rose-colored glasses. Ever heard old people talk about the good old days? Yeah, those were the days when polio, segregation, and child labor were alive and well. Rosling points out that the past wasn't just not great, it was objectively worse in almost every way. People were poorer, sicker, and had shorter lives, but we forget that because we focus on the nostalgia and ignore the suffering. In fact, one of Rosling's favorite tricks is to ask people how they think the world has changed over the past 50 years. Almost everyone assumes things have gotten worse. More poverty, more suffering, more war. But the data tells a different story. Extreme poverty, cut in half in the last 20 years. Child mortality, down by 50% since 1990. Girls in school, higher than ever before in human history, but you wouldn't know that because the media isn't exactly throwing a parade for these successes. And that brings us to the second problem. News is a fear factory. Rosling doesn't mince words here. Journalists are not here to inform you. They're here to keep you watching. And the best way to do that? Constant panic. A plane crash will be front page news for weeks, but a historically safe year for air travel? Not a headline in sight. That's why your brain is convinced that terrorist attacks are spiraling out of control, even though you're more likely to die from choking on a pretzel than from terrorism. And then there's the final trap. People think it's rude to admit things are improving. Ever had a conversation where someone was ranting about how terrible the world is, and the second you point out a positive fact, they look at you like you just kicked a puppy? That's the negativity instinct at work. There's this bizarre idea that acknowledging progress means you don't care about ongoing problems. But here's what Rosling wants you to understand. You can recognize improvement and still care about fixing problems. You can celebrate progress without being complacent. You can acknowledge that the world is getting better and still fight for more change. This isn't about ignoring suffering. It's about seeing reality clearly, the good and the bad. So how do you fight your negativity instinct? Rosling gives a few strategies. 1. Expect bad news. The media reports on the exceptional, not the normal. That's why you hear about every rare disaster, but never about the billions of people quietly living better lives than their grandparents. 2. Don't censor history. If someone says, things used to be better, make them be specific. Were things better when child mortality was through the roof? When women couldn't vote? When medicine was basically just leeches and prayers? 3. Learn to see progress and problems. Just because there are problems in the world doesn't mean everything is falling apart. Think of the world like a premature baby in an incubator, still fragile, but getting stronger every day. The negativity instinct is a trap, and if you fall for it, you'll be forever miserable, forever paranoid, and forever wrong about the state of the world. But if you can fight it, you'll see reality for what it is. A world that still has problems, yes, but is getting better in ways people never imagined. Key takeaway: the world isn't getting worse, it's getting better. The problem is that your brain, the media, and social norms all conspire to make you think otherwise. Chapter 3. The Straight Line Instinct. Your brain is a lazy fortune teller. It looks at a trend, extends it in a straight line, and acts like it has seen the future. You see population growth and think, we're doomed. It'll just keep growing forever until we're packed like sardines. You see an economic crisis and assume, well, guess I'll be broke forever. You look at your credit card debt and figure, might as well give up and live in a cardboard box. This is the straight line instinct. The dumb, oversimplified way our brains assume that if something is increasing or decreasing, it'll just keep going that way forever. And it's completely wrong almost every time. Hans Rosling rips this instinct to shreds with one of the scariest graphs he ever saw, the Ebola outbreak in 2014. At first, the news showed a straight line increase. 1 case, 2 cases, 3 cases, manageable, right? But when Rosling looked at the real data, he saw something much worse. The numbers weren't increasing in a straight line, they were doubling. 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32. That's exponential growth, the kind that turns small problems into global catastrophes. And because people assumed the outbreak would keep rising in a straight line, they reacted way too slowly. The result? An epidemic that killed thousands. But here's where things get interesting. The opposite mistake happens all the time too. People look at global population growth and assume it will keep skyrocketing until the planet is overrun with humans like a zombie apocalypse. But the reality? Population growth isn't a straight line. It's slowing down. Rosling explains it brilliantly. Imagine a baby growing from birth to 6 months old. In those first months, they double in size. If you followed the straight line instinct, you'd assume that by age 10, that baby would be 13 feet tall. Obviously ridiculous. Growth slows over time. The same thing happens with population growth. Yes, the world's population has exploded in the last century, but Rosling points out something crucial. The number of children in the world has already stopped increasing. That's right. stopped. The number of babies born each year has leveled off at about 2 billion, and experts predict it won't rise again. Population will still grow for a while because those kids will grow up, but once they do, total population growth will slow dramatically. Yet people still panic. They still assume we'll just keep adding people forever, ignoring that birth rates always drop as societies develop. It happened in Europe, it happened in North America, and it's happening right now in Africa and Asia. The idea that the world is just getting more crowded is straight line nonsense. Rosling also tackles another straight line myth: poverty and economic development. Some people assume poor countries will always stay poor, while rich countries will just keep getting richer. But history says otherwise. Japan used to be as poor as India. South Korea was once poorer than Somalia. Countries change, economies shift, and if you assume they won't, you're just proving how little you actually know about the world. The problem is that straight line thinking feels safe. Your brain wants simple predictions. It hates uncertainty, so it latches onto easy, dumb ideas like the rich will keep getting richer, climate change will just keep getting worse forever, or AI will replace every job by 2030. But reality isn't a straight line. Some things speed up, some slow down, some even reverse direction completely. So how do you stop yourself from falling into this trap? Rosling gives a few key strategies. 1. Recognize that curves come in different shapes. Some trends follow an S-curve, slow at first, then fast, then slow again. Others rise and then fall, like birth rates. Very few things in nature follow a perfectly straight path. 2. Question your instincts. The next time you find yourself assuming something will just keep happening, ask, is that actually true, or is my brain being lazy? 3. Look at the data. Not the headlines, not the Twitter hysteria, the actual numbers. Because here's the truth. If you let the straight line instinct control your thinking, you will be wrong about everything. You'll panic about problems that are fixing themselves. You'll ignore problems that are actually accelerating, and you'll waste your energy worrying about the completely wrong things. Key takeaway. Almost nothing in the real world follows a straight line. If you assume trends will continue forever without slowing, stopping, or reversing, you're not predicting the future. You're just proving you don't understand how the world actually works. Chapter 4. The Fear Instinct. Your brain is paranoid as hell, and it's making you dumb. You're walking around terrified of the wrong things, convinced that the world is a terrifying, crime-infested, apocalyptic hellscape when, spoiler alert, it's really not. But your fear instinct doesn't care about reality. It cares about keeping you scared. Hans Rosling calls this the fear instinct. Your brain's deeply ingrained tendency to focus on frightening, dramatic, and unusual risks while completely ignoring the mundane, everyday dangers that actually kill people. Your brain loves to blow things out of proportion. Terrorist attacks? You're terrified. Plane crashes? You're sweating. But did you know that diarrhea kills more people than all of these scary things combined? No, because your brain and the news doesn't care about boring everyday dangers. It wants shock value. Rosling opens the chapter with a wild story. He's a junior doctor in Sweden when suddenly, bam, a plane crashes. Helicopters bring in the wounded, the hospital staff panics, and young Hans is thrown into emergency mode. But here's the kicker. While all the drama was unfolding in the ER, another patient was quietly dying of hypothermia, a far more common and predictable danger. And nobody noticed because we're all wired to pay attention to sensational threats rather than realistic ones. Fear sells. Fear gets attention, and if you don't control your fear instinct, you will consistently misunderstand reality. The news is the worst offender. It feeds off your fear instinct like a parasite. Every day, your TV or phone tells you, breaking news, something terrifying just happened. But what they don't tell you is how rare these events actually are. You hear about earthquakes, terrorist attacks, plane crashes, murders, and nuclear leaks, but you never hear about workplace accidents, heart disease, or car crashes, even though those kill far more people. The media is in the business of fear, and you are their favorite customer. Rosling lays out 3 major types of fear that your brain falls for every time. 1. Fear of physical harm. You're terrified of violence, animals, and natural disasters. But guess what? The world has never been safer. You're less likely to be murdered, eaten by a lion, or killed in an earthquake than at any other time in human history. 2. Fear of captivity. You hate the idea of losing control, which is why kidnappings, airplane hijackings, and government crackdowns freak you out. But statistically, these events are extraordinarily rare. 3. Fear of contamination. You panic over invisible threats like radiation, chemicals, and pandemics, even when the actual risk is tiny. Ever heard of the Fukushima nuclear disaster? Thousands fled in fear of radiation, but how many actually died from radiation poisoning? 0. The real deaths came from the evacuation itself. Elderly people dying from the stress of being moved. Fear killed them, not radiation. The paradox of fear is that while the world is getting safer, people are getting more afraid. Rosling shows this with crime statistics. The murder rate has plummeted in most developed countries, but if you ask people, they'll tell you that crime is worse than ever. Why? Because crime is still happening, and the news won't shut up about it. You don't hear about the millions of people who weren't murdered today, because that's not a story. One of Rosling's favorite examples of misplaced fear is terrorism. People are obsessed with it, but let's do some math. In 2016, 0.05% of all deaths worldwide were caused by terrorism. Meanwhile, 1.4 million people died from traffic accidents that same year. But are you terrified of getting in a car? No, because your fear instinct is a terrible risk calculator. Rosling doesn't just expose your stupidity though, he gives you a way to fix it. He offers 3 simple strategies to control your fear instinct. 1. Understand that fear is a terrible guide to reality. If something makes you feel afraid, that doesn't mean it's actually dangerous. Your emotions are not evidence. 2. Calculate real risk. Risk isn't just how dangerous something is, it's how often you're actually exposed to it. Shark attacks are terrifying, but you're not swimming in the ocean every day. Meanwhile, heart disease is silent but everywhere. 3. Calm the hell down before making decisions. Fear distorts your thinking. If you're panicking, you're probably making dumb choices. Step back, get perspective, and ask if the fear is justified. Rosling's bottom line? The things that scare you the most are usually not the things that will kill you. The world isn't as terrifying as it seems, but if you let fear control you, you'll always believe it is. Key takeaway: your fear instinct lies to you. It makes you obsess over rare, dramatic dangers while ignoring the real risks in your life. If you want to see the world clearly, stop letting fear decide what's important. Chapter 5: The Size Instinct. Your brain is terrible at understanding scale. It sees a big number and freaks out. It sees a small number and shrugs. It doesn't ask, compared to what? It just reacts. This is the size instinct, and it's why you have absolutely no idea what's actually important. Hans Rosling opens this chapter with a brutal example: child deaths. Every year, millions of babies die. It's a horrifying number, but Rosling does something most people don't. He compares it. In 1950, over 14 million infants died per year. Today that number is 4.2 million. Now, is 4.2 million still tragic? Of course. But compared to the past, it's a miraculous improvement. Yet when people hear 4.2 million dead babies, their brain only sees the horror, not the progress. They get outraged, they panic, they assume things are getting worse. That's the size instinct in action. Your brain doesn't just underestimate progress though, it also overestimates problems when the numbers look scary. Ever heard someone rant about how immigrants are taking over? People in Europe and the US routinely guess that immigrants make up 30 to 40% of the population. The real number? Closer to 10%. But your brain doesn't do proportion, it just panics. And then there's the media, which loves to abuse your size instinct. Big numbers make great headlines. Millions of refugees sounds more dramatic than 0.3% of the population are refugees. Billions spent on foreign aid sounds scandalous until you realize it's less than 1% of government budgets. The media never gives you comparisons because comparisons make things boring. Rosling argues that the size instinct is dangerous because it distracts us from real solutions. Take global healthcare. Politicians love cutting ribbons at big hospitals. Hospitals look impressive. They cost millions. But guess what? Hospitals don't save the most lives. The real lifesavers are boring, cheap things like vaccinations, clean water, and midwives. But those don't come with photo ops, so people ignore them. Rosling gives a simple fix. Stop looking at single numbers. Always compare. Always divide. Instead of just seeing 4.2 million dead babies, ask, how many was it last year? Last decade? What percentage of births is that? If you don't do this, you'll keep making dumb assumptions. You'll think crime is skyrocketing when it's dropping. You'll think poverty is getting worse when it's improving. You'll waste your time panicking over big but meaningless numbers while ignoring small but crucial ones. Key takeaway: big numbers are meaningless without context. If you don't compare, divide, and ask the right questions, your brain will consistently misinterpret reality. Chapter 6: The Generalization Instinct. Your brain is a lazy classifier. It loves to dump everything into neat little categories and slap a label on them, whether that label is accurate or not. You do it unconsciously, all the time. You hear Africa and think poor starving kids. You hear Middle East and think war zone. You hear America and think obesity and guns. Your brain is stupidly obsessed with generalizing, and it's leading you to some truly ridiculous conclusions. Hans Rosling calls this the generalization instinct, the human tendency to take a few examples and assume they apply to an entire group. And let's be clear, generalization isn't always bad. It's how language works. If you couldn't generalize, you wouldn't even have words for things. But when you overgeneralize, you become blind to crucial differences and massively misunderstand reality. One of Rosling's favorite examples is the way people talk about developing countries. For years, everyone assumed there were just two types of nations, rich and poor, developed and developing, the first world and the third world. But guess what? That's complete garbage. There is no third world. Most countries are somewhere in the middle, steadily improving their economies and living standards. But your brain clings to outdated, useless categories because it loves simple narratives. The media is your biggest enabler. Journalists love to throw around blanket terms like the middle class or rural America or gang member because they're convenient. But what do these words actually mean? Who qualifies as middle class? Are all rural communities the same? Is every gang member a violent criminal? When you use broad categories without questioning them, you shut down your ability to understand the world properly. And then there's stereotyping, the ultimate form of lazy generalization. People assume all Muslims are the same, all Asians are good at math, all Africans live in poverty, and all Americans are gun-loving fast food addicts. You know this is nonsense, but your brain still defaults to these generalizations because they're easy. You don't want to think about the complexity of individual lives, so you settle for an oversimplified cartoon version of reality. Rosling gives a brutal example of how dangerous generalization can be. In the 1960s, doctors made a deadly mistake. They noticed that unconscious soldiers in battlefields survived more often if they were placed on their stomachs rather than their backs. So, they generalized that principle to babies, advising parents to put infants to sleep face down. What happened? Infant deaths skyrocketed. It wasn't until 1985 that doctors realized their mistake. Babies are not unconscious soldiers, and sleeping on their stomachs was causing sudden infant death syndrome, SIDS. Thousands of babies died because of a bad generalization. Generalization can also make you blind to change. Take Africa, for example. People still talk about it like it's a single, hopelessly poor continent, but parts of Africa are booming. Countries like Nigeria, Kenya, and Ethiopia are rapidly growing economies, full of entrepreneurs, universities, and thriving cities. But if you're still picturing Africa as nothing but malnourished kids in huts, you're decades behind reality. So how do you fight the generalization instinct? Rosling lays out some key strategies. 1. Look for differences within groups. The next time you hear someone say Europe or Asia like it's one single thing, push back. Europe includes both Norway and Greece. two completely different economic realities. Asia includes Japan and Afghanistan. You think those are remotely the same? 2. Look for similarities across groups. Stop assuming that Western and non-Western cultures are worlds apart. A middle-class family in Brazil has more in common with a middle-class family in Germany than with someone living in extreme poverty in their own country. 3. Be wary of the majority claims. When someone says the majority of people do X, ask what percentage? Is it 51%? 99%? Vague statements like most people are often meaningless. 4. Beware of vivid examples. Just because you saw one dramatic news story about a violent crime in Chicago or a tragic famine in Africa does not mean it represents the whole place. The media thrives on exceptions, not averages. 5. Assume people are not idiots. If someone is doing something that seems irrational, don't just write them off as stupid. Ask yourself, in what way is this a smart solution for their situation? What seems bizarre to you might be completely logical in their reality. Rosling drives home the point with a genius idea called Dollar Street, a project that visually categorizes people not by country, but by income level. He sent photographers to homes all over the world and showed how a poor family in Uganda lives much like a poor family in Bangladesh, while a wealthy household in Mexico looks a lot like one in Sweden. Geography is not the main divide, income is. Your generalization instinct is wrecking your understanding of the world. It's making you believe in imaginary divides, outdated stereotypes, and massive oversimplifications. The world is complex, fluid, and ever-changing. If you keep clinging to lazy categories, you'll stay blind to reality. Key takeaway: categories are necessary, but bad generalizations will make you misunderstand everything. Always question your labels, challenge stereotypes, and look for the exceptions that break the rule. Chapter 7: The Destiny Instinct. You think people don't change. You think cultures are set in stone. You think entire continents are trapped in their destiny, doomed to stay exactly as they've always been, and you are dead wrong. Hans Rosling calls this the destiny instinct, the deeply ingrained belief that people, countries, and cultures are bound by their history, that the way things have always been is the way they always will be. It's lazy thinking, and it blinds you to the constant, undeniable progress happening all around you. Take Africa. People love to talk about Africa like it's one big hopeless mess, as if the entire continent is eternally stuck in poverty. Rosling recalls a conversation with a wealthy investor in Edinburgh who told him with absolute certainty, there's no chance Africa will ever make it. It's their culture. The arrogance, the ignorance, the sheer stupidity of assuming that because a place has struggled in the past, it will struggle forever. But let's check the facts. 50 years ago, China, India, and South Korea were way behind where parts of Africa are today. And what did people say back then? Oh, Asia will never develop. It's their culture. Fast forward to today, China is the second largest economy in the world. South Korea is a tech powerhouse. India is a global player. Asia didn't magically overcome its destiny. It just evolved, like every other part of the world has over time. But the destiny instinct is strong. It tells people that certain societies are forever backward. It makes Europeans think they have always been the most advanced civilization. False. It makes Americans think their dominance is inevitable. False. It makes some Middle Eastern countries assume their political struggles are a permanent curse. False. Nothing is permanent. Everything changes. Rosling shreds another favorite misconception, the idea that religion locks people into specific behaviors forever. People assume that because some predominantly Muslim countries today have restrictive laws for women, they always will. But rewind a few decades and you'll see a completely different story. Iran in the 1970s, women in miniskirts, Afghanistan in the 1960s, women in universities, societies move, and no religion, culture, or ideology is immune to change. Still don't believe it? Let's talk about Sweden. The oh-so-progressive, gender-equal, liberal Sweden you know today was shockingly patriarchal just a few generations ago. Women couldn't vote until 1919. Abortion was illegal until 1975. Domestic violence laws were weak. The idea that Sweden has always been a beacon of progress, pure fantasy. So why do people cling to the destiny instinct? Because it's comforting. It simplifies the world. It allows people to look at struggling countries and think, well, that's just how they are, instead of asking hard questions about history, politics, and economics. It lets people assume their own country's success is inevitable rather than a result of hard choices, policies, and luck. Rosling gives another devastating example: gender equality. The destiny instinct convinces people that deeply ingrained gender roles can never change, yet history says otherwise. The macho, controlling values we associate with certain cultures today, Sweden had them too. The idea that women should be equal in the workplace, in politics, in marriage, that's new even in the West, and the same changes are happening right now in other parts of the world. The biggest lie the destiny instinct tells you is that slow change is no change. If progress doesn't happen overnight, people assume it's not happening at all. But slow change adds up. A 1% improvement every year might seem insignificant, but in a few decades, it completely transforms a society. Look at education. In 1970, the global average for school years completed was around 5. Today, it's closer to 9. That's a massive shift in just a few decades. So, how do you fight back against this lazy, self-satisfied way of thinking? Rosling gives you a few strategies. 1. Remember that slow change is still change. Don't expect revolutions overnight. A country's progress might not make headlines, but that doesn't mean it isn't happening. 2. Look for counterexamples. If someone says, this country will never improve, find another country that did. History is full of nations, economies, and cultures that transformed in ways people thought impossible. 3. Check your own country's past. If you think a society can't change, look at how much your own has evolved in the last 50 years. The destiny instinct is dangerous because it makes people blind to possibility. It makes investors ignore emerging economies. It makes policymakers assume some problems are unsolvable. It makes everyday people believe that poverty, oppression, and ignorance are just how things are. They're not. The world is changing all the time. The only question is whether you're paying attention. Key takeaway: nothing is set in stone. Cultures change, economies grow, and societies evolve. The belief that some people or places are destined to stay the same is one of the biggest lies you've ever believed. Chapter 8: The Single Perspective Instinct. Your brain is a one-trick pony. It loves simple explanations. It craves the security of a single narrative, a universal solution, a one-size-fits-all answer. It wants to believe that one ideology, one expert, one number, or one theory can explain everything. And this is why you misunderstand the world constantly. Hans Rosling calls this the single perspective instinct, and it is one of the most dangerous cognitive traps you fall into every single day. The moment you believe one idea explains everything, you've stopped thinking. People do this all the time. Some believe the free market is the solution to every problem, while others think government intervention is. Some blame capitalism for everything wrong in the world, while others think socialism is the devil. You see this in politics, economics, healthcare, climate change, education, everywhere. People cling to one perspective like a life raft, ignoring anything that challenges it. Rosling isn't having it. He rips apart the idea that any single approach is always right. Want an example? Let's talk about democracy. Everyone loves to claim that democracy is the key to a successful society. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Some of the fastest growing economies in history, like South Korea in the 1970s and China today, were built under authoritarian regimes. Meanwhile, some struggling countries are democracies. So, does that mean democracy is bad? No. But it means reality is more complex than your oversimplified worldview allows. Rosling argues that people fall into the single perspective instinct for 3 big reasons. 1. It's comfortable. Thinking is hard. It's much easier to believe that one ideology or one expert has all the answers than to accept that reality is a messy, unpredictable mix of different factors. 2. It feels smart. Once you pick a single perspective, you start seeing it everywhere. If you think capitalism is the root of all problems, then every issue will seem like proof of capitalism's failure. If you think government is always the problem, you'll blame bureaucracy for everything. Confirmation bias takes over. 3. It makes you part of a tribe. Holding a single perspective makes you feel like you belong. You're either a pro-business conservative or a tax-the-rich progressive. You're either pro-nuclear energy or anti-nuclear at all costs. Nuance is the enemy of tribalism. Rosling also takes a sledgehammer to the belief that experts always know best. Yes, experts are important, but they have a problem. They are specialists, which means they see the world through their narrow field of expertise. If you ask an environmental scientist what matters most, they'll say climate change. If you ask an economist, they'll say GDP growth. If you ask a doctor, they'll say public health. Everyone thinks their field is the most important, but reality doesn't care about their tunnel vision. And then there's numbers. People love to act like statistics are the ultimate truth, but Rosling warns, numbers can mislead you if you don't question them. If you rely on just one statistic, like GDP, life expectancy, or CO2 levels, you'll miss the bigger picture. Countries with high GDP might have massive inequality. Nations with low CO2 emissions might also have zero economic growth. A single number never tells the whole story. So how do you stop falling for the single perspective instinct? Rosling gives you a survival guide. Test your own ideas for weaknesses. If you believe something strongly, actively look for evidence that contradicts it. If you can't find any, you're probably not looking hard enough. Listen to people who disagree with you. Instead of surrounding yourself with people who reinforce your beliefs, seek out opposing views. Debate, question, be open. Remember that expertise has limits. If a doctor tells you about politics, or an economist tells you about climate change, be skeptical. Experts are not gods. Avoid hammer thinking. If you only have a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. If you're obsessed with one solution, more government, less government, more education, less regulation, etc., you'll try to apply it to everything, even when it makes no sense. Use numbers, but not just one number. Always ask, what is this number missing? What else should I be looking at? What context is missing? The single perspective instinct is dangerous because it shuts down your ability to think critically. The world is complex. No single ideology, no single expert, no single number can explain it all. If you let yourself believe otherwise, you will always be wrong. Key takeaway: there is no single explanation for the world's problems. The moment you believe one idea, one ideology, one expert, or one number has all the answers, you have stopped thinking. Chapter 9. The Blame Instinct. You love pointing fingers. You love finding a villain. You love the satisfaction of saying it's their fault and then moving on with your day like you just solved the problem. But you didn't solve anything. You just gave your brain a lazy shortcut to stop thinking. Hans Rosling calls this the blame instinct, and it's ruining your ability to understand the world. You think everything bad must have a clear, evil mastermind behind it. You assume every crisis is the result of greedy corporations, corrupt politicians, or some shadowy elite pulling the strings. And while, yes, corruption and greed exist, the truth is usually far messier and way less dramatic than your conspiracy-loving brain wants it to be. Rosling starts with a hilarious example. He's in a hotel shower and the water is ice cold. He turns the handle up, nothing happens, so he cranks it to the max. Boom. Scalding hot water burns his skin. His immediate reaction? Who did this to me? He wants to blame the plumber, the hotel manager, maybe even the person in the next room using cold water. But the truth, nobody did anything. The pipes just took time to adjust. The only one at fault was his own impatience. And that's how you react to everything. When the economy crashes, you want to find the one corrupt banker who caused it. When a plane crashes, you want to blame the one pilot who messed up. When a company pollutes a river, you want to attack the CEO sitting in a fancy office somewhere. But Rosling warns, this kind of thinking is dangerously stupid. Let's take plane crashes. You hear about a tragic accident and immediately people blame the pilot. Maybe he was sleepy, maybe he was reckless, but blaming the pilot doesn't stop future crashes. The real question is, why was he sleepy? Why did he make that mistake? What about airline policies, fatigue management, training? If all you do is blame one person, you miss the systemic failures that actually caused the disaster. The same goes for corporations. People love blaming pharmaceutical companies for not researching cures for rare diseases. They're just greedy, people yell. But Rosling gives a reality check. Big Pharma doesn't run on greed, it runs on financial incentives. If you want them to research life-saving drugs for poor people, you don't need a villain, you need a new system that makes it profitable. And then there's blaming the media. You think journalists are lying to you, that they're hiding the truth, that they're all just puppets of some corrupt system. But most of the time, the media isn't deliberately misleading you. They're just feeding you what gets the most attention. And what gets the most attention? Drama, fear, scandals. It's not a grand conspiracy, it's just basic business. If you want better media, you need to demand better content, not scream about how the news is fake. The blame instinct is so baked into human nature that it even shows up in history. Ever heard of syphilis? That horrifying disease that rotted people's skin and bones? Well, every country in Europe blamed it on someone else. The Russians called it the Polish disease. The Polish called it the German disease. The Germans called it the French disease. The French called it the Italian disease. And the Italians? They called it the French disease right back. Nobody wanted to take responsibility, so they just picked a scapegoat and moved on. Rosling argues that this instinct is especially dangerous in politics. You probably have a favorite villain, a political party, a country, a leader, a billionaire, and anytime something bad happens, you immediately assume they are responsible. But reality doesn't work that way. Big events, recessions, wars, social issues aren't caused by one evil genius in a dark room. They're caused by complex systems with multiple factors at play. If you reduce everything to "it's all because of them," you stop thinking critically. And this doesn't just apply to blame. It applies to credit too. You probably also overestimate how much impact one person has when things go well. CEOs, presidents, tech billionaires, they all love taking credit for changing the world, but often their success was part of a much larger system of historical trends, policies, and social shifts. If Steve Jobs had never existed, would we have smartphones? Yes. If Elon Musk disappeared tomorrow, would electric cars still be the future? Yes. No single individual is as powerful as we like to believe. So, how do you break free from the blame instinct? Rosling lays out a simple mental reset. 1. Stop looking for villains. Most problems are not caused by some evil mastermind. They're the result of multiple factors interacting over time. 2. Stop looking for heroes. One person is rarely responsible for massive change. It's usually a system of people, policies, and trends working together. 3. Ask better questions. Instead of "who's to blame?" ask "what are the deeper causes?" Instead of "who deserves credit?" ask "what systems created this success?" The blame instinct is your brain's way of being lazy. It makes you feel like you understand the world when, in reality, you're just pointing fingers at the nearest target. If you actually want to change things, you need to stop blaming and start understanding. Key takeaway: blaming individuals for big problems is almost always an oversimplification. If you really want to solve issues, you have to stop pointing fingers and start looking at the larger systems at play. Chapter 10: The Urgency Instinct. You are addicted to panic. You fall for every single now or never sales pitch thrown at you. You hear, "we must act immediately," or "disaster is certain," and you lose your ability to think critically. You are wired to believe that everything is an emergency, and Hans Rosling is here to tell you, it almost never is. The urgency instinct is the human tendency to believe that we must act immediately, that we are on the brink of catastrophe, that if we don't do something right now, we are doomed. And it is one of the most dangerous instincts you have because it shuts off your ability to think rationally. Rosling gives a fantastic example. Salespeople love to exploit your urgency instinct. "This is a limited time offer. Buy now before it's too late." Sound familiar? Activists do it too. We must act today or the world is finished. Politicians, same game. If we don't do this right now, society will collapse. It's all the same trick. Rush you into action before you have time to think. The irony? The most important decisions in the world are rarely urgent. You don't need to sign that contract right now. You don't need to panic about the latest crisis just because the news is yelling about it. You don't need to make snap judgments about complex global problems. Urgency makes you stupid. Rosling tells the story of his own worst mistake. In 1981, he was working as a doctor in Mozambique when he encountered an outbreak of a mysterious disease that caused paralysis. He immediately assumed the worst. It's contagious. We must act now. The mayor, panicked by Rosling's alarm, closed the roads to prevent the disease from spreading. But guess what? The disease wasn't contagious at all. It was caused by poisoning from a local food source, and because the roads were closed, supplies couldn't get in, people starved, and many died unnecessarily. That's what the urgency instinct does. It makes people act first, think later, and when you don't think, you make terrible decisions. The media thrives on this instinct. The news loves to make everything seem like a catastrophe. Breaking news, the world is collapsing. But did they ever follow up on their past disasters? Did they ever say, oh, turns out that wasn't the end of the world after all? No, because panic keeps you watching. And let's talk about climate change. Is it real? Yes. Is it serious? Yes. But Rosling warns that exaggeration doesn't help. He recalls a conversation with Al Gore where Gore told him, we need to create fear. Rosling refused. Because when you exaggerate the urgency of an issue, you lose credibility. People stop believing you, they tune out, and then, when a real crisis happens, nobody listens anymore. So, how do you fight the urgency instinct? Rosling gives some life-saving advice. 1. Take a breath. If someone tells you, we must act now, pause. Urgency is a red flag that someone is trying to manipulate you. 2. Demand data. If something is truly urgent, there should be measurable evidence to back it up. If the only argument is fear, it's probably nonsense. 3. Beware of worst-case scenarios. People love to predict apocalyptic futures, but ask yourself, how often have these predictions actually been right? 4. Avoid drastic action. Real solutions take time and careful planning. Quick fixes usually make things worse. Rosling doesn't say we should ignore real threats. He just says we should stop panicking about everything. The world has real problems, but solving them requires calm, rational thinking, not blind urgency. Key takeaway: the world is not ending tomorrow. The next time someone tells you to panic and act immediately, step back, breathe, and think first. Chapter 11. Factfulness and Practice. Congratulations, you've made it to the final chapter. But before you pat yourself on the back and think you've got it, let's be real. You're still a mess. You still instinctively panic at bad news. You still make dumb generalizations. You still blame villains for problems that are way more complex. And if you think listening to this summary magically fixed your brain, think again. That's why Hans Rosling doesn't just end with, hey, hope you learned something. No, he gives you a battle plan, a way to actually apply factfulness in real life. Because knowing these instincts exist is useless if you don't actively fight against them every single day. Rosling starts with a powerful story about how factfulness saved his life. In 1989, he was in a remote village in what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo. He was there to study an epidemic of a mysterious disease causing paralysis. The villagers? They weren't thrilled. In fact, they were furious. They thought he was there to steal their blood. Armed men with machetes surrounded him, and his translator whispered, "We should run." But Rosling didn't run. Instead, he stood his ground and asked, "What's the problem?" He didn't panic. He didn't react emotionally. He didn't assume these people were just irrationally violent. He listened, and then, out of nowhere, a barefoot woman stepped up. She explained, in perfect logic, that the villagers were afraid their blood would be taken for profit, like in other villages. Then, to Rosling's amazement, she rolled up her sleeve, turned to the crowd and said, "Here, doctor, take my blood." The tension broke. The crowd calmed, the machetes went down, and just like that, factfulness saved his life. Rosling tells this story because if a woman with no formal education, no internet, and no statistics training could think critically in a life or death situation, then you, sitting comfortably in your modern, safe, highly educated life, have no excuse. So how do you actually practice factfulness in daily life? How do you stop falling for all the nonsense that warps your perception of the world? Rosling lays out clear, brutally simple rules. 1. Teach kids the truth about the world. We teach kids about volcanoes that they will never see, stars they will never visit, but not about how the world actually works today. Schools still teach old narratives about rich versus poor countries, even though that model doesn't exist anymore. Kids should learn about the 4 income levels, not just rich and poor. They should learn that most countries are in the middle, not stuck in some imaginary third world. 2. Question lonely numbers. A single number is always misleading. The crime rate has gone up. Compared to when? By how much? In what context? Is it actually high, or are we just hearing about it more? Every number should be compared and divided before you react. 3. Stop being afraid of out there. People on level 4, rich countries, live the safest lives in history, but they obsess over distant threats. You panic about terrorist attacks on the other side of the world, but you don't wear a seatbelt in your own car. You fear plane crashes, but don't think twice about heart disease, which is actually what will kill you. 4. Embrace the 80-20 rule. Not all problems are equally important. If you see a long list of issues, find the biggest ones first. Most problems are small and irrelevant, but a few massively outweigh the rest. Focus on those. 5. Stop glorifying the past. You think the world was better before? You're lying to yourself. The past was full of child mortality, oppression, and disease. Yes, some things were better, like having less social media drama, but overall, the world is objectively improving. 6. Look at gradual improvements, not just dips. People freak out over short-term problems while ignoring long-term progress. One bad economic year, we're doomed. A political scandal, the country is collapsing. But zoom out, things are getting better over time. 7. Ignore the noise. Focus on the big risks. You spend too much energy worrying about things that don't matter. If you want to be smart about the future, worry about the 5 biggest global risks. Global pandemics. Yes, Rosling called this before COVID-19. Financial collapse, World War III, extreme poverty, climate change. Everything else? Stop panicking. Rosling ends the book with a final message. Factfulness is not about ignoring problems, it's about seeing them clearly. The world has real issues, but you can't solve them if you're constantly panicking about imaginary ones. If you can control your instincts, question your assumptions, and demand real data, you'll not only see the world more clearly, you'll actually be able to make it better. Key takeaway: factfulness is a skill, not a belief. If you don't actively practice it, you will keep falling for the same mental traps over and over again. Conclusion: so, you made it to the end. You've been slapped around by reality, exposed for how wrong you were about nearly everything, and hopefully you're questioning your entire worldview right now. Good, that means you're paying attention, but don't get too comfortable, because you're still not as smart as you think you are. Hans Rosling didn't write Factfulness so you could smugly nod along and say, "Ah yes, I already knew all this." He wrote it because you didn't, because your instincts are broken, because your brain loves outdated ideas, oversimplified narratives, and fear-fueled nonsense. And if you don't actively fight against these instincts, you will keep misunderstanding the world, making terrible decisions, and embarrassing yourself in conversations. Let's be real. Most people will never read this book. They'll keep believing the world is getting worse, that we're all doomed, that their political enemies are pure evil, and that their personal opinions are just as good as hard data. But you don't have to be one of those people. You can be smarter. You can be the person who actually sees reality clearly, while everyone else panics over nonsense. The world has real problems, but they are solvable. If people can stop drowning in fear, blame, and stupidity long enough to actually work on them. But to do that, you have to break your bad thinking habits. You have to learn how to spot misleading news, manipulative statistics, and your own dumb assumptions. You have to challenge your own beliefs instead of just attacking other people's. And let's be honest, you're not going to remember all of this just from listening to one summary. Buy the damn book, read it again, highlight it, argue with it, use it to call out people who spew misinformation. Give it to that one friend who thinks every problem has a single villain, or that poverty is permanent, or that everything is getting worse when it's not. Because the truth is simple. The world isn't as bad as you think, and you're not as smart as you believe. But if you can practice factfulness every day, you'll at least be less wrong than everyone else, and that's a damn good start.